We've got Grant Miller here from Ingenuity Studios. Hey, Grant.
How's it going?
Good. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I'm a partner and visual effects supervisor here at Ingenuity. I started off in video games back in 2007 before transitioning to visual effects. I've been doing that since then.
Right on. What are you going to be talking about today?
Talking about our studio's transition to USD, kind of some example products like Spotify that we did, but really just kind of a broad overview of the challenges we faced, the hurdles we had to overcome, and then just a lot of the benefits that you get kind of running a USD pipeline.
Excellent. Looking forward to it. Let's jump in.
All right. My name is Grant Miller. I'm a partner and visual effects supervisor at Ingenuity. I'm here today to talk to you about world building with USD inside of Houdini. So first off, what we do. Normally I would show the reel here, but to kind of save time, I figured I'd just go over, we do commercial work, variety of stuff for TV. We do a lot of kind of small to medium-sized features, typically stuff that we can kind of be the sole vendor on. And then we do, music videos, really tend to be very fun and creative projects for the artists. And then just a lot of television stuff from, half-hour comedies all the way up to kind of big budget hour-longs and really everything in between. So hopefully some stuff you recognize, hopefully some stuff you've seen. And with all of that work come, a lot of production challenges for us. We have a pipeline that really kind of has to work for all of the projects. We're not big enough to be siloed into different departments. So, everyone kind of is on the same pipe, and that pipe has to, work for television and music videos, which have really tight turnarounds, and has to work for films, which have, longer stuff, and commercials as well. We also need to work quickly while still staying organized. So doing a 2-week turnaround on a music video, you can't get to the second to the last day before delivery and kind of have everything be a mess. Everything still needs to be notable and do revisions and track stuff like that. And then we also need to do a lot of simultaneous work across departments. So we can't kind of wait assembly line for stuff to get done. So what is USD and how does it kind of help us achieve that? I tend to describe it as an alembic with kind of materials and referencing, which is, kind of a bare minimum explanation, because it supports rigs, it supports volumes, it supports really powerful instancing. It's kind of a really long list of stuff that you can use. And the biggest one for me is that it's super light and it's super fast. So it really has kind of changed the way we think about assembling really big scenes. And it's got, universal there in the name. So there's a XKCD about, how universal standards end up just becoming 15 competing standards. And I really hope that that's not the case with USD, because it really does solve a lot of problems that the other formats really still struggle with. So, why USD? The biggest one for me is that you have kind of an instant asset system. So you're saving stuff in a format that you can easily pop it off the shelf and use it in your scene without a lot of fuss. It's not an alembic with maybe the materials as some sort of Maya sidecar file that you're then pulling in and kind of combining together with some sort of tools or script. It's the renderable thing that you have as an asset that you can just pop into the scene. You also have one format for everything. So it really is universal in that sense. So like I said earlier, you're saving your volumes, you're saving your hair, you're saving everything that kind of encapsulates that scene in a single format. And then it's cross application. So you can play nicely with, Maya, Blender, Unreal, obviously Houdini. It doesn't really matter where your kind of stuff is coming from. At the end of the day, it's all kind of coming in the same format. And as an artist, you're not having to pick, I want to save this as an FBX because it's a rig, and you kind of remove a lot of the complexity in that regard. So USD assets. Like I was saying, it's all types of assets, hair, volumes. You can also do rigs, which is a really big one for us. This means that we can do crowds and have the cost for those things be really low. You can swap out the animation. It kind of stays really light without paying to, do point cash for every single person. So it also supports assets of all sizes. So most asset systems, this fire hydrant would be an asset, but then in USD, you can also pull that fire hydrant into, a little corner bodega, and that's maybe made up of, dozens of other assets. And then I can publish that bodega out and pull it into, a very larger layout, and make up Brooklyn. And, each of those scenes is really all just composed of single USD assets. And they're file referenced. So I'm only paying for the cost of that fire hydrant once. This is a GIF from Toy Story, actually, but it's one that I actually have it saved on my computer and kind of show people when they're asking about USD. It's really a great example of just how large of a scene you can kind of assemble with USD, and the complexity that you can kind of get in there and still be able to tumble around and work with as an artist. Something that you wouldn't really consider assembling something this large before this was around. And all of that really promotes reuse. It's once you have trees that you can just pop off the shelf and into your scene, you tend to use them more. You tend to use cups and trash and little accents and stuff more, and that results in richer scene dressing. So if you're dressing a street, it may just call for the street and a couple of cars, but now that we have all of these assets in place, it's very easy to kind of toss in the trees, toss in the weeds growing out of the the cracks in the sidewalk, the trash that's swept up against the curb, toss the fire hydrant in there, toss the bollards and toss the street signs. And, you kind of you build up a much more visually interesting, complex image for relatively low cost, just the cost of dressing. And all of that stuff is kind of lazy load. So, as I'm browsing that scene, Houdini's Hydra viewport does a great job of not loading, the tiny stuff that you don't see or care about until you're kind of down there. So you can zoom out and really kind of see broad strokes stuff, and then kind of dive in and get to the specifics. So with that, you also get faster export times, because the files on disk don't need to be re-exported, just the reference to them does. So you're kind of working in this native format that really lets you get to the first pixel quite quickly. And that also saves space, because again, you're only paying for that fire hydrant once, even though you've got 1,000 fire hydrants in that, scattered around in the city. And lastly, it working cross application really just helps, everyone kind of play nicely together, and leaves us free to not really care about where those assets are coming from. And all of this really promotes kind of building together. Ideal shot workflow, you're doing layout, and then that's passed off to animation, and that's passed off to effects, and that's passed off to lighting. But a realistic shot workflow is that, for us at least, we'll start with a temporary camera, and then lighting and animation and effects all start the second we have that. Kind of blocking their stuff in, blocking in the lighting, doing tests for the effects, and then we might get the actual camera track back, and then anim and effects will adjust their stuff accordingly. Lighting will have another pass. We'll do a render and comp it, and then effects and animation will come back in. And that, that whole time, you really want to promote this kind of concept of agile collaboration. You want to be minimizing the blocking of, downstream departments from upstream ones, and kind of maximizing at the same time the context that each of those departments has with the work that they're doing. And then a huge one for us is just that we like to always be rendering. So we find that the more you kind of iterate on something, the better it looks at the end of the day. So if we can, kick off every night, kind of not have the work of, oh, let me update the scene and pull everything in and have it go, but just to kick off every night a 10 frame half res render of stuff, you kind of get to see it every day and make notes, as opposed to kind of waiting for those bigger updates. So layering in USD is really an important one to touch on. Each department is basically overriding the previous. So if animation needs to move a wall back in order to frame a shot up, as layout dresses that wall and adds posters and sconces and whatever, that wall is going to stay moved back in that shot. And to accomplish that, the hierarchy and naming stuff, it really becomes quite crucial. But that's what really unlocks a lot of the power in terms of kind of those department overrides and kind of being able to work very flexibly and smartly with everyone else. And that work does feel quite natural as a Houdini artist, at least, kind of, primary application that I use. So I think it's it's something that people will be pretty familiar with. I tend to think of the layers more as instructions. So effects might author a layer that's, doing the sim for a piece of cloth on a character. And you're basically saying that, the points and the normals use these instead. Same with look dev might author a collection of objects and assign a material to them. Same with lighting. So it really kind of flows down. And if you can have that in mind when you're working, it can save you a lot of time down the road. So modeling and animation can play nicer together. Animation doesn't have to recache anything if modeling needs to update the UVs, because animation is just caching the points and normals. So it's, you have a lot less of this kind of round tripping through, and it's the same for effects and lighting. Because effects is kind of publishing stuff back to the same hierarchy, the lighting tends to break less. You're not getting an effects cache that's suddenly completely different from the modeling scene that you were doing in lighting on prior. And it also lets you do really procedural material assignment. So it's very trivial in USD to assign glass to all of the windows asterisks in the scene, and assign brick to all of the brick asterisks in a single building. So it makes it easy to do overrides as well. Just a lot of that stuff kind of becomes very procedural. So to talk about that more, we're going to watch a little breakdown behind the scenes of a Spotify commercial that we recently completed, and this was, end-to-end USD, kind of one of the bigger jobs that we've kind of put through, and really kind of helped set the tone for where we think that's going. So we'll watch that now. Cool. So one of the scenes, the biggest scene really in that Spotify commercial is this Utopia environment. It actually contains all of this Utopia kind of area, and then back up here is the tree that Billy sits in. So that whole environment is kind of contained in here as well. And I ran out of colors, but each of these is really kind of is all a separate USD. When we were initially doing this scene file, we kind of laid out in rough blocking form, the broad strokes of where, this downtown area was going to be, where these foreground cliffs were going to be, where each of these kind of little city sections was going to be. And then we dumped all of those out to USDs, and then, several artists kind of went and worked on, effects, working on the waterfalls and people dressing little trees around their area, but they're all kind of coloring and playing within the lines. So there's a very clear space that is defined for them where they can add stuff and add little details and bridges and shrubbery and stuff like that. And it really helped us kind of get a scene this large assembled in a relatively quick amount of time, and something that wouldn't have been possible had we all kind of been, just working independently of each other. And then also on the lighting front, because all of that stuff was published as USD, as people versioned up, you just kind of got the latest pulled back in. So this was really, for me as a supervisor, really fun to kind of watch this scene just progressively get better as every day kind of passed on the project. But in order to accomplish that stuff, you really need to nail that initial layout, because that is kind of the foundation that everyone kind of is going to be working in. So really important to kind of get stuff on the screen early and be flexible and kind of make sure that you're making revisions kind of early on, kind of nailing that stuff down. One of the best parts about USD is really just how supercharged the instancing is. It's now completely fine to scatter a million rocks across a terrain. It feels, I don't know if for those who have experience, like a forest pack kind of situation inside of 3D Studio Max. So it really just can work very realistically. You don't have to kind of constrain yourself to how large the scene is going to be or what the export times are going to be. And it also lets you cut fewer corners. I find that we don't have to like make LODs of the trees and have a low res version in the background or anything like that. Like it's you can really kind of use the full res everything all over the place, which just saves time also from an artist front and removes a step that isn't enjoyable. You really just want to kind of render the scene and dress the scene full resolution all the time and not kind of care about the constraints. And finally, you can also do really complex instancing. So for Blackpink, we instanced each of the buildings complete with their lights, complete with their spinning holograms and all the materials and stuff like that around several times to kind of create the wide of the city. And you're still only paying for that building once, so that the rendering still stays quite quick, but you're instancing kind of a full tree of stuff, as opposed to just having to instance the lights separately from the buildings and instance the holograms separately from those. So really just a really powerful way to work, which kind of brings me to USD and Houdini. So when you're working inside of Solaris, you're working natively with USD. The output of every node is USD. Any of your cache files are your render files. So there's no translation to RIB or to a V-Ray scene or anything like that. And that's just really, I think, an important thing to kind of understand, in that, the viewport is a representation, is a Hydra delegate of those USD files. So what you see there is what you're going to see in the renderer. And it just kind of removes a lot of the, it looks fine in the viewport, or it looks fine in Mantra, or it looks fine on my end kind of stuff from doing effects, from doing scene assembly, from doing layout. And really just kind of feels like SOPs for objects in a lot of ways. And I think that's, one of the things that we've kind of used to make that transition and to make it kind of understandable and relatable to the artists. You have a lot of really powerful inspection tools, so full hierarchy view, full kind of node level, object level, inspector, just gives you a lot of the like geometry, spreadsheet kind of vibe, but at the object level, which is really useful for kind of debugging, oh, the velocity is missing on this object when it gets imported, or, oh, it doesn't have the primvars that it needs, stuff like that. And you need all of that stuff once you really start to kind of build up, kind of real production level complexity. So this is the Solaris node tree for the Utopia environment, and also Billy's kind of tree stuff is in here as well. So it's big, but it's not enormous, because a lot of that stuff is parsed out as other USDs, and then assembled here in this scene. And kind of diving in here, there's two setups for the lighting, one for the Utopia environment and one for the tree, and the day and night versions of both of those. And all that is kind of managed in here and switched accordingly for the different passes. And then coming down the tree further, you have the, kind of the submission. So USD, another great thing for us is that it enables this kind of multi-shot workflow that we've always wanted. You can build one really kind of large asset, and then, if I need to move a branch in a shot, or I need to swing the key around in a shot, I can make those changes in a procedural fashion, and that stuff can flow downstream and not have to, miss the updates that come from the larger asset. So, notes like making the dome, 15% brighter in all the shots are also still easy because you're still kind of pulling from that same main asset. And then we have a, kind of a multi-publish workflow where you're defining which shot you're going to render to, and then you can merge all of those together and kind of submit it to the farm in one go. So you're, as a lighter, you're not kind of hopping into individual shots and doing that work and trying to keep track of changes and stuff like that. So it really removes a lot of the complexity and a lot of the, potential pitfalls in that workflow. And then another really great part about using USD inside of Houdini is just how powerful the patterns are. In addition to wildcards, you have type selection, component selection. You have a lot of really cool Vex functions for like, is this stuff active? Is this stuff visible? Doing overrides based on that, which help really kind of keep the procedural material assignments alive and just having less stuff break when you update. And finally, it's a lighter's dream. You have very viewport centric tools for placing lights, placing highlights, placing shadows, light mixer, light with kind of light grouping for, tinting all these lights green or taking all of the backlights down 50%. So it just kind of makes working on larger scenes like this plausible and enjoyable and really kind of pain-free. And then finally, having procedural render passes. So, that that anything that's inside of scene, forest, trees is going to get a shadow pass on the ground. Stuff like that. Updating with layout and not having to kind of reset that stuff up is really great. But all of this stuff is kind of enabled by pipeline. So for us, at least, we found that collaboration really kind of goes hand in hand with having a good pipeline, keeps everything consistent, keeps everything where it should be, and lets everything come in kind of an expected format. So one of the kind of first hurdles that we had with USD was this challenge of nested assets. So to go back to a previous example, if I dump out a fire hydrant and I pull that into my bodega scene, and then I dump the bodega out and I pull that into my larger Brooklyn scene, as a lighting artist working on that shot, I don't want to have to go 2 scenes away and hit publish just to get the version 2 of the fire hydrant. So we solved that by kind of always wanting to be on the latest. But then there's challenges that kind of are associated with that as well. And we looked to solve those with this resolver. So the resolver is USD kind of allows you to procedurally at the time of request say which path is going to be returned for a given file path, for a given file reference. So talking through this as an example is probably the easiest. If I import Tree Oak version 1 and I lay out the trees in the park and I import that park into a city and then I publish Tree Oak version 2, as a lighter, I just have to hit refresh and the city is updated. And that's because when I imported that oak tree, I didn't import version 1, I just imported an oak tree. And it's always just going to find me the latest version of that oak tree that gets published. This was easily kind of the hardest part of our transition. Just from a pipeline standpoint, there was a lot to kind of figure out to get this stuff up and running. And hopefully while I maybe have a side effects here, I think, doing an example of that, even if it's just a file system based kind of C++ example of a resolver or kind of moving that functionality into Houdini, I think is something that we'd love to see in the future because it is a little bit of a tricky kind of fiddly part to sort out. The second part of this USD pipeline stuff was the creation of automatic kind of layered files, so the collector files for a given asset. So in our asset USD, we kind of pull in the layers of each department's work, and those are auto created with each new publish. So if the modeling gets published and then the look dev gets published on top of that, and then another version of the modeling gets published, all of that stuff is kind of always pulled into that latest asset, and that asset is what you're importing into the scene as a person doing layout or lighting. And that script also auto generates variants. So if you want the model without the shading, you can turn that off easily, that sort of thing. And so it works the same for shots, loading each department's work in and kind of doing that same override process. And the shot USD is actually what you're loading as an artist into your scene file as your kind of baseline for work. Each department layer is kind of muted in that scene file. So, me as an effects artist, you're muting the effects layer, doing your work in that file, and then publishing that back out to the shot USD. So you're kind of working in a contained area with still the full context of, what's happening in that shot. And this is really crucial to kind of let, person doing lighting, person doing layout know how their changes are kind of affecting the scene, so that you're not putting a tree in front of a light, or that you're not, doing lighting that's going to be blocked by, an effects setup that comes kind of later. So yeah, future plans for us with USD. We do want to kind of open source that resolver. It's a fair bit of work to kind of detangle it from our larger pipeline, but that's something that we're kind of looking into. We also, the Unreal team, grew leaps and bounds during the pandemic. We're doing a lot of kind of previs virtual production type stuff in there now, and we really see a lot of kind of cross-pollination potential between Unreal and USD in terms of just kind of doing, broad strokes layout, previs, stuff like that inside of Unreal, and then, popping it into USD, linking it up to those same kind of high-res assets and rendering it. And finally, we're still kind of working through refining how we assemble scenes in Solaris. Every time we do it, it kind of seems to get better. And it's definitely a work in progress at the studio, and something that we're looking forward to kind of see improve in the later versions of Houdini. So come work with us. We're artist owned and operated. We have a great variety of really fun, creative projects. Each person really pulls a lot of weight. It's kind of a high impact, no ego kind of culture. So yeah, check us out online, and hopefully see you soon. Thank you all. Cheers.